Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something, but the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment. Then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone. It was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What do you think it is? Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer. I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals, glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. You think it's some kind of broadcast? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. I don't think it's a broadcast at all. What do you mean? He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. We see you. My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. What the hell was that? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. We see you. I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. I think we should leave, Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small, glowing device pulsing with an eerie, cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once, an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind, but I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet. The winding back roads of Kentucky had always been remote, a stretch of deep valleys and towering trees that twisted through land forgotten by time. This is where I'd set my camper up for the night, figuring it would be a peaceful rest stop. It was 1994. My name's Hank Lell, by the way, and I've lived a solid 50 years with enough bad habits to fill a book. Never imagined a camping trip would bring me the wildest chapter of them all. I'm not what you'd call a nature guy, but after a string of bad dates and a nagging brother who kept telling me to get out of my own head, I figured a weekend alone in the woods might do the trick. As I parked my RV, the silence settled heavy. There wasn't another person for miles. Or so I thought. I poured a stiff drink, leaned back in my lawn chair, and listened to the sound of crickets echoing through the hollow, watching the shadows grow thicker as dusk turned to night. The plan was simple. Just sit out here, have a few drinks, maybe roast a marshmallow or two, then get some sleep. Nothing complicated, nothing like what was coming. Just after midnight, I heard a rustle, not like the wind through the leaves. This was different, heavier, deliberate. I brushed it off at first, but the crunching and snapping of twigs grew closer, louder, almost like someone was circling my RV. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it around, casting the beam across the trees. Nothing. Just dense woods stretching out in every direction. Figuring it was some kind of wildlife, I shut off the light, muttering to myself that I was too jumpy for my own good. But as soon as the light went out, the rustling started again. Closer this time, circling like a predator closing in on prey. Then I saw him. A shadow slipped between the trees, barely visible in the dim moonlight, but it was enough to send every alarm in my body ringing. He stepped into view, and I'll be damned if he didn't look like he just crawled out of a horror flick. His clothes were shredded, a grimy flannel shirt hanging off his frame, his skin caked in what looked like mud, or worse. The man's face was expressionless, blank as a stone wall. He didn't blink or shift his weight like a normal person would, just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, his eyes locked on my camper, with a look that chilled me deeper than the night air. I hollered at him, tried to sound tougher than I felt. "You lost, buddy? Need some help?" He didn't answer, didn't move, just kept staring. After a minute, he took a step forward, his hand reaching into his pocket. I heard a metallic click that echoed through the silence like a gunshot, and it didn't take much to figure out what he was holding. Instincts kicked in. I dove back into the camper, slamming the door shut, fumbling with the lock. My heart hammered like a jackrabbit caught in a trap as I leaned against the door, listening. Silence. And then a low scraping sound. Metal on metal. He was dragging something along the side of the camper. I grabbed the biggest knife I had, some beat-up old hunting blade that I wasn't sure would even hold an edge. Every muscle in me was locked tight as I forced myself to breathe, to listen, to prepare. The scraping stopped, replaced by the slow, creaking sound of the camper door handle turning. A loud thump sounded as he tried the door again, harder this time. The lock held, but I knew it wouldn't for long. My eyes darted around the camper, looking for anything I could use, anything that could give me a shot if he managed to break in. That's when I remembered the flare gun in the emergency kit by the door. Not exactly meant for close combat, but it was all I had. I stood there clutching that flare gun, the cold handle pressing into my palm, my fingers trembling despite my best efforts. The man outside let out a strange, high-pitched laugh, a sound that was half amusement, half madness, and then silence. The seconds dragged by, each one stretching out longer than the last. I almost thought he'd given up. Almost. Suddenly, a loud crash rattled the camper, nearly knocking me off my feet. The window beside the door shattered, glass spraying across the floor like a rain of ice. I raised the flare gun, pointing it at the broken window, my finger hovering over the trigger. His face appeared in the opening, grinning in a way that made my skin crawl. He had this look, like he was savoring the fear, feeding on it. His hand reached through the broken window, grasping for the door handle from the inside. Without thinking, I fired. The flare shot out in a burst of light, striking him square in the chest. He screamed, a sound so raw and wild it cut through the night, echoing through the trees as he stumbled back, clawing at the flare embedded in his shirt. I didn't wait to see if he'd stay down. I grabbed my keys, shoved them into the ignition, and floored it. The camper roared to life, lurching forward as I tore down the narrow road, barely keeping it steady on the uneven ground. My hands were slick with sweat, knuckles white as I gripped the wheel, trying to put as much distance between me and that maniac as possible. In the rearview mirror, I saw him, just a flicker of his silhouette as he staggered to his feet, still clawing at the burning flare. But he didn't follow. He just stood there, watching as I drove away, his figure fading into the darkness until he was nothing but a memory. By the time I reached the nearest town, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me drained, numb. I parked outside a diner, stumbled inside, and must have looked like hell because the waitress didn't ask any questions. She just handed me a cup of coffee and nodded when I asked about a police station. Turns out that guy wasn't some random lunatic. He was known around these parts, a backwoods recluse with a reputation for stalking campers. Rumored to be into all sorts of twisted stuff, animal sacrifices, cult rituals, you name it. Locals called him Hollow Jack. The police had tried to catch him before, but he was slippery, like a shadow in the woods, and the authorities had no luck finding him that night either. Just a trail of burnt leaves and shattered glass where my camper had been. They found his camp a week later, deep in the forest, hidden among the trees. The sheriff called me down to identify a few things they'd found. My broken flare gun, for one. But there were other items, things that turned my stomach just looking at them. Jars filled with, well, it's better left unsaid. Let's just say Hollow Jack had been collecting more than firewood out there. The sheriff leaned in, his voice low. He's still out there, probably watching folks, just like he did you. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last. But something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70 heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive, needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister, bones for the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter, Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me, just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit working and stuttering like it was trying to fight off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was greeted with a gust of frigid air. It smelled wrong in there, like cold metal and something decayed, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and won't leave. I shined my light into the back, trying to figure out what was causing the problem. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping. No, not tapping, scratching. It was coming from the crate, a large wooden crate strapped down in the center of the trailer, covered in heavy chains. My heart started to pound in my chest, the kind of adrenaline spike that tells you to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching got louder. The crate shifted just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I wasn't going to open it. Not in a million years. I slammed the trailer door shut and locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Whatever was in that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B, no questions asked. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Some government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated and I jumped in my seat. Static, then through the fuzz I heard something faint. A voice. A woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. "No," I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days, that's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. I thought they were just shadows at first, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people. Ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long, flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again. Then came the knocking. Loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road again, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open. And then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, but blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse like it was alive, like it was breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirling in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But one voice stood out. One voice I knew, Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I'd seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I'd ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust, I could see them again, the figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar, faces I'd seen on the road before. Long dead truckers. Friends. Then, as if the storm itself parted, I saw her, Carol, standing in the middle of the road. Her white dress flowing in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it slid across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone. No signal. No way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again, Carol, walking slowly toward me. Her face pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. "Roy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. "It's time to come home." I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me. My name's Stephen Gibson, and this all went down in 2020 out in Glacier National Park, Montana. To be honest, I'm no outdoorsman. I was dragged into this RV camping trip by my friend Josh, who swore that getting off the grid would be good for me. I guess he thought fresh air would cure my burnout attitude towards city life. He was probably right about the burnout part, but nothing prepares you for real danger, especially the kind you don't see coming. Josh, ever the wilderness guy, had planned everything down to the last detail. Food, water, gas, maps. He had it all covered. He even convinced a couple of friends, Katie and Max, to tag along. He'd known them since college, and we'd met a few times at parties. They were solid people, good for a laugh and some great stories. So I figured, why not? I could use a break. We set up camp along a small clearing that looked out over a mountain lake. The view was almost worth the 6-hour drive from civilization. The air was crisp, the stars were insane, and we were miles from any kind of cell signal. It felt like the world had shrunk to the size of our campsite and the dense forest around it. By the second night, I was finally relaxing, enjoying the quiet for once. The only sounds were our own voices, a crackling fire, and the occasional rustle from the trees. Around midnight, Josh decided to walk down to the lake to fill a couple of canteens. He waved off anyone who offered to join him, cracking a joke about not needing a babysitter. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just being the usual Josh, Mr. Independent. But when he didn't come back after 20 minutes, Max started getting antsy. He'd been staring out at the darkness beyond the trees, muttering something about how bears come out at night. We were in bear country after all. "Relax, Max," Katie said, though she didn't sound as sure as she looked. "Josh probably just got distracted. You know how he is with stargazing." But when another 10 minutes passed with no sign of Josh, I decided to head down to the lake myself. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out, figuring I'd find him sprawled out on a rock, admiring the stars. But the lake was empty. The canteens were abandoned by the shore, and there was no sign of him. I shouted his name, the sound bouncing off the still water and echoing back to me. Nothing. By now, a bad feeling had settled in my gut. I headed back to camp, where Katie and Max had started pacing, the tension thickening by the second. We all decided to head out together and look for him. Katie had a flare gun in case of an emergency, and we had flashlights. I tried to keep calm for everyone's sake, but something about the silence in those woods was unnerving, like we were the only ones making any noise. As we trekked deeper, following the trail Josh should have taken, a stench started to fill the air, a rotten, metallic smell that made us stop in our tracks. Max gagged and covered his nose. Katie and I exchanged glances, her face as pale as I felt. Then a sound, a crunching noise, like someone stepping on twigs and leaves. I froze, holding my breath, hoping it was Josh stumbling back to us. But what we saw instead, it wasn't him. A man stepped out from the shadows, his face smeared with something dark, thick, and oily. He wore an old, ragged jacket, his shirt torn, exposing scars and patches of filthy skin underneath. He was big, muscular in that terrifying, wiry way, with a crazed, unfocused look that seemed to go right through us. For a second, he just stood there like he was sizing us up, taking in every detail. Katie raised the flare gun, her hands trembling. "Where's Josh?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she looked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he grinned, a twisted, ugly grin that made my skin crawl. He lifted a blood-stained knife, letting it glint under our flashlights. That sight was all it took for Max to lose it. He bolted back toward the campsite, but the stranger didn't chase him. He just watched, his grin widening, almost like he enjoyed our fear. "Run," I whispered to Katie, who looked at me, eyes wide, not needing to be told twice. We turned and sprinted, the flare gun slipping from her grip and clattering to the ground. I heard her curse but didn't stop. My only thought was to get back to the RV, get out of this nightmare. Back at camp, Max was already yanking the RV door open, his eyes wide with panic. Get in now," he shouted, waving us over as if his life depended on it. because it probably did. Katie and I practically dove into the RV and Max slammed the door shut, locking it. We all sat there catching our breath, staring at each other in stunned silence. Then, without warning, something heavy hit the side of the RV with a sickening thud. The whole thing shook. Katie screamed, covering her mouth, and I stumbled backward, tripping over one of the seats. "Drive, Max!" I shouted, but he just sat there frozen, his eyes locked on the window. I followed his gaze, and there he was. The man, just standing there, staring at us with that twisted grin. Finally, Max snapped out of it and slammed his foot on the gas, the RV lurching forward, tires spinning in the dirt. We careened down the rough trail, branches scraping against the sides, the headlights barely cutting through the darkness. Every so often, I'd glance back, half expecting to see him running after us, but the trail was empty. After a few minutes, Max slowed down, his hands shaking so bad he could barely keep the wheel steady. "What the hell was that?" he cried, his voice breaking. "No idea," I said, struggling to keep my own voice calm. "But Josh, we need to get help." We drove through the night, not stopping until we hit the nearest ranger station, where we practically fell out of the RV, each of us a mess of nerves and panic. The stranger on duty looked at us like we were insane, but the second we mentioned Josh was missing, he radioed for backup. It took hours, with the sky starting to lighten, before we finally got word. They'd found something by the lake where Josh had disappeared. Only it wasn't him. It was remains, scattered along the shoreline, torn up in a way I don't even want to remember. They never found Josh, not completely. And as for the man we saw, they said he was some kind of hermit, a survivalist with a violent past who'd been seen in the area before, but had never attacked anyone. Until now, they took our statements and a search team scoured the area for days, but they never caught him. The last we heard, he was still out there, roaming the wilderness, leaving signs for the unlucky few who crossed his path. I don't know if he was hunting, or if he just liked watching people fall apart. Either way, they say he knows every inch of those woods. As we left, the ranger told us one last thing. "You're lucky you got away. Most people who meet him, they don't." I never wanted to take the job. Not this one. But when the bills pile up and your savings start running dry, you do what you have to, even if it means going back to the place you swore you'd never see again. Dead Man's Pass. It was Eddie's death that did it. 15 years ago, I lost my brother on that road. His rig skidded off a curve and plunged into the canyon. I was driving a mile behind him when it happened, saw the whole thing through my windshield like a damn nightmare unfolding in slow motion. I've never been the same since. I never could forgive myself for not doing more, not being there to help. That's how it goes in this life. You haul, you drive, you move forward, keep the past in the rear view. But it's never that simple, is it? I'm Hank Collins, but most people on the road know me as Rusty. Maybe it's the hair going gray, or maybe it's just the wear and tear of 30 years behind the wheel. I've spent most of my life running rigs, hauling everything from livestock to construction equipment. This time, I was hauling heavy machinery for a mining outfit in Utah. Easy enough, or so I thought. The cargo didn't bother me. What bothered me was the route. Route 163 through the heart of Monument Valley, and then up through Dead Man's Pass, the very stretch of road where Eddie lost his life. I'd avoided it for years, but I couldn't avoid it this time. The money was too good, and the job came at a time when I needed it most. The first sign that something wasn't right came when I crossed into the desert. The vast expanse of red rocks stretched out for miles, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. It should have been peaceful, almost beautiful, but there was something off. The radio cut out first, static, then silence. Not unusual out here, but it didn't sit right. The stillness felt heavy, oppressive, like the desert itself was holding its breath. As the sun slipped away completely, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably another trucker making the same route, but as the miles passed, those headlights didn't get closer. They stayed there, far back but steady, like whoever it was didn't intend to pass or fall behind, just keeping pace. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. The canyon walls began to rise on either side of me, the road narrowing as I approached Dead Man's Pass. My hands tightened on the wheel, the familiar knot of tension growing in my chest. The road was winding, dangerous, with steep cliffs on one side and jagged rock on the other. I'd driven it 100 times before, but not since the night Eddie died. As I climbed higher, the truck started to act up. First, it was the brakes. They began to make a grinding noise that sent vibrations up through the cab. They were new, serviced just a week ago. No reason they should be failing. Then, the engine sputtered. Just once, but enough to make my heart jump. "Come on, Rusty," I muttered to myself. "Just keep moving, 1 mile at a time." But the truck didn't listen. The headlights behind me were still there, never getting any closer, never fading away. Something about it gnawed at me, a slow realization creeping in. I knew that truck. It was Eddie's. It couldn't be. Of course, Eddie's truck was a wreck at the bottom of the canyon, rusted and forgotten. But the make, the model, even the busted left headlight, it was all the same. And it was following me. I turned up the CB, hoping for some noise to drown out my thoughts, but all I got was static. My hands were sweating now, the wheels slick beneath my fingers. The canyon walls seemed to press in tighter as I reached the most dangerous curve, the very spot where Eddie went over the edge. My foot eased off the gas, but then the CB crackled to life and a voice broke through the static. "Rusty, Hank, you gotta stop." I nearly jerked the wheel in shock. I knew that voice. It was impossible, but I knew it. It was Eddie. "Eddie," I whispered, even though I knew there was no way it could be real. I fumbled with the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the voice only grew louder, swallowed by the hiss of static. "Rusty, you gotta stop. You can't make the same mistake." I was losing my mind. That's what this was. Too many years on the road, too many ghosts haunting me. That's all it was. But then the truck sputtered again. The grinding in the brakes got worse. I could feel the whole rig shudder as I tried to slow down, but the brakes weren't responding. I pumped them hard, but nothing. The curve was coming up fast, and I knew I wouldn't make it if the brakes didn't hold. "Damn it," I shouted, yanking the wheel hard to the right, pulling off onto the narrow shoulder. The truck screeched to a stop, just inches from the cliff's edge. For a long time, I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the drop below. The canyon stretched out beneath me, at a black abyss, swallowing the last traces of daylight. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking, and then I saw it. Eddie's truck was still there, sitting on the road behind me, headlights glowing dimly through the dust. But now I could see it wasn't just a truck. The rig was mangled, twisted, just like it had been after the accident. The front end was smashed in, the cab crumpled, the windshield shattered, and standing next to it was Eddie. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but he didn't disappear. He was there, as clear as day. His face was pale, gaunt, eyes hollow, but it was him. He was looking right at me. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know what I expected to happen, but I had to get closer. I had to see Eddie. My voice cracked as I took a step toward him. How are you?" He didn't speak, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. Then slowly he raised a hand, pointing down the canyon. I followed his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. The wreckage of his truck lying at the bottom of the canyon, just as it had been all those years ago. "No," I whispered. This can't be real." Eddie's voice echoed in my mind, though his lips didn't move. "You gotta stop, Rusty. You gotta stop running." I fell to my knees, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had run from this for so long, buried it deep, but now there was no escaping it. Eddie wasn't here for revenge. He wasn't here to haunt me. He was here because I'd never let him go. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears burning my eyes. "I'm sorry, Eddie. It was my fault. I should have listened. I should have stopped." The wind howled through the canyon, and for a moment it sounded like Eddie was speaking again. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was forgiveness. "I never blamed you, Rusty," his voice whispered, softer now, like it was being carried away by the wind. "But you gotta forgive yourself." The headlights of Eddie's truck flickered once, then went out. The figure standing beside it began to fade, dissolving into the dust and shadows of the canyon. And then he was gone. I sat there on the edge of the road, staring down into the canyon where my brother's truck had fallen. The air was still, the only sound the soft hum of the desert wind. I didn't know how long I sat there, but when I finally got to my feet, something had shifted inside me. The guilt was still there, but it wasn't crushing me anymore. It wasn't tearing me apart from the inside. I could breathe again. I climbed back into the cab and started the engine. The truck roared to life, and the brakes responded this time, smooth and steady, as I pulled back onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There was nothing there. No truck, no headlights, just empty miles of desert behind me. I smiled a sad, tired smile. It was time to stop running. Time to go home. As I drove through Dead Man's Pass, the echoes of the past faded into the night, leaving only the road ahead. My name is Samuel Ford, and this happened back in 2010, just outside Olympic National Park, Washington. I thought I'd give the RV life a whirl, get off the grid for a bit, and maybe catch some solitude with my dog Boomer, a scrappy old mutt who didn't mind my sense of humor or my questionable taste in music. Just me, the forest, and my metal playlist blaring out in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a week-long getaway, parked in a spot off an old logging road. Trees stretched out for miles, thick and endless, and a damp mist seemed to linger no matter what time of day it was. The locals I ran into at a small gas station in Forks, yeah, that place from those Twilight books, warned me about some wild types that roam the woods. People who didn't exactly believe in personal space or property. But I figured I'd be fine. I had Boomer, a big flashlight, and a knife that probably needed sharpening. The first night, everything was quiet. Just me and Boomer in the RV, the rain tapping a rhythm on the roof that could have put anyone to sleep. I woke up a few times to check out any odd sounds, but it was usually just the forest settling, critters doing their thing. By morning, I felt like I was getting into the groove of it, brewing coffee in the damp and letting Boomer roam a little while I cleaned up the RV. That's when I found the first sign something wasn't right. Just outside the RV, half covered in mud, was a bone. Not some animal bone either. This one was distinctly human, too small to be anything else. And I've watched enough true crime shows to know a femur when I see one. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it could have come from a bear or some other animal's leftovers, but that would have been the wishful thinking of someone who hadn't just found human remains in his camping spot. I threw it into the forest figuring maybe it would be best if I just forgot about it and got out of there, but I hadn't seen anyone else around, and leaving right then felt like quitting. I brushed it off, even laughed a little. Maybe the wildlife here had a dark sense of humor too. The next couple of days were uneventful, almost enough for me to let my guard down. I spent some time fishing by the lake, cooking up the sad little trout I managed to catch, and even started thinking about extending my stay. That was until Boomer started acting strange. He'd whine and growl at the empty darkness beyond the campfire's glow, his ears pinned back and his eyes scanning the shadows. Normally, he wasn't the skittish type, but that night, he wouldn't stop barking. At first, I figured it was just some raccoon or maybe a stray deer, but Boomer's hackles were up, and he had this way of letting me know when something was really wrong. Then it happened. Around 2 a.m, I heard footsteps. Not the animal kind, either. These were slow, methodical, like someone trying their best not to make noise but failing miserably. I froze, listening. Boomer stood by the door, growling low, his whole body tense as a live wire. It wasn't just the footsteps. There was this clinking sound, like metal tapping against something hard. Each step echoed closer, and I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. Grabbing my flashlight, I peered out through the RV's window, sweeping the beam across the shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A figure, hunched, wrapped in tattered clothing, moving just outside the reach of the light. I whispered a curse under my breath, and Boomer barked louder. The figure stopped. I killed the flashlight, hoping maybe they'd think the place was empty and move on. But that's when I heard it. The unmistakable creep of the RV's back door handle. The faint sound of it twisting, testing if it was locked. Instinct kicked in. I fumbled for the knife I kept in the drawer by the sink, gripping it tighter than I'd ever held anything in my life. My breath hitched as I pressed myself against the wall, keeping Boomer quiet with a firm hand on his scruff. The door rattled again, and then I heard a muttered voice. Low, scratchy, like someone who hadn't spoken in a while. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like gibberish mixed with a sick kind of laughter. Suddenly, the RV jolted. I nearly dropped the knife. Whoever was outside was trying to tip the whole damn thing over. I heard a crazed shout, some slurred words that might have been in English, and then another violent shake. The cupboards banged, dishes clattered, and Boomer was barking like mad, his hackles high, teeth bared, ready to tear into whatever had the nerve to come after us. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity, I peeked out the window again, barely breathing. Nothing. Just the quiet, dark forest. I'd convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally gone. But then I saw it, on the other side of the RV. A tall, wiry man, his face smeared with dirt, staring right back at me. His eyes held a wildness I'd only seen in caged animals. His hair was matted, sticking out in clumps, and he wore a ragged coat that looked like it hadn't been off his back in years. I backed away, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching, head cocked to the side like he was trying to decide what to do with me. Then, without a word, he started tapping the side of the RV rhythmically, his fingernails scraping against the metal. I don't remember making the decision to get out of there. I just acted. Scooping up Boomer, I threw him into the passenger seat, cranked the engine, and floored it, not caring if I tore up the road or blew out a tire. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, just watching us go. I thought that was the end of it. Figured I'd drive into town, report the guy to the local cops, and move on with my life. But when I reached the gas station in Forks, there he was, leaning against a battered old truck, staring at me like he'd been waiting the whole time. I'm not proud to admit it, but I froze. I should have driven straight to the police, but something about the way he looked at me made my blood run cold. Leaving Boomer in the RV, I walked over, my heart pounding in my chest, every nerve on edge. I asked him what he wanted, trying to keep my voice steady, to look unafraid. But he just smiled, a thin, crooked smile that twisted his whole face into something almost inhuman. "Just keeping an eye on my territory," he rasped, his voice scratchy like he hadn't spoken in years. "You're on borrowed land, friend, gotta pay your dues." I didn't know what he meant, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I told him to stay away from me, that I'd be calling the cops, but he just laughed. I heard him mumble something under his breath about the woods reclaiming what's theirs. As I got back in the RV, I peeled out of the lot and didn't look back. That night, I parked in a crowded campground, thinking the lights and people would keep me safe. But around midnight, Boomer started growling again. When I opened my eyes, I nearly screamed. There, outside the window, his face pressed against the glass, was the same man. This time, he held something in his hand. A clinking, jagged piece of metal. I didn't stay long enough to find out what he intended to do with it. The last I saw of him was in my rearview mirror as I tore down the highway, heading as far from those woods as I could. I filed the report with the police, but they never found him. Said there had been rumors of hermits, squatters in those woods for years, and that I wasn't the first to have a run-in with someone who thought the forest belonged to them. As I write this now, the memory of his face still lingers. That twisted smile burned into my mind. I don't go near the woods anymore, and every time I hear that faint tap, 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 I wonder if he ever really stopped watching, or if he's still out there somewhere, waiting. The road into the Adirondacks was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark green needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed. Complete isolation. No people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp, with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I'd been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine: gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured, probably a bored hiker from weeks ago. But as I moved through the forest gathering wood, I found more of them. Carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about, just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it. A soft, rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved, tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But after a long moment, the rustling stopped, the trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere, slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning. Endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake, trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Adirondacks, it's different." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once, and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. "Local ghost stories." The man didn't smile. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right, and something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it," he turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he'd looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening, back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For hours, I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move, but it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite. The same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the adder, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still out there, somewhere in those woods. It was still watching, and maybe it always would be. Camping out in the middle of North Dakota's Cheyenne National Grassland, I'd been working too many hours at my job back in Fargo and wanted a couple of days off the grid. Just me, my RV, and endless prairies stretching out as far as the eye could see. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just open skies, the occasional deer, and a solid excuse to keep my phone on airplane mode. My wife, Abby, wasn't thrilled about it. "People do weird things in the middle of nowhere," she said when I left. I laughed it off, saying something about how the grassland was basically a prairie Disneyland with buffalo instead of Mickey Mouse. She wasn't amused, but I promised to be safe and stay near the established camping sites. So there I was, setting up in a secluded spot a good half-mile from the nearest camper. The evening had that eerie kind of silence you only get in wide-open spaces. No trees for the wind to rustle through, no buzzing streetlights. It was a different world altogether, and I loved it. After a couple of beers, I got my folding chair positioned just right for sunset, a slight breeze keeping the bugs away. About an hour later, I noticed another camper, a rusty old van pulling into the clearing across from mine. Its windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but I thought nothing of it at first until the guy driving it stepped out. He was huge, maybe 6.5 feet tall, with a build that looked more like he was designed in a factory than born. He wore a red plaid shirt frayed around the collar and jeans that looked like they'd been through a dozen bar fights. The first thing that caught my eye, though, was a scar that ran from his jawline to the side of his mouth, twisting his lip into a permanent, lopsided grin. It wasn't the kind of thing you saw on your average happy camper, that was for sure. I tried not to stare, but then he caught my eye and waved with an odd, almost forced enthusiasm. I waved back, though maybe a little too casually, like I wasn't sure if I was acknowledging a fellow camper or someone who wanted to stab me. Then he yelled out, "Hey there, buddy! Nice place you picked." His voice was gravelly, loud enough to carry even across the clearing. I offered a polite nod, not wanting to invite more conversation. Something about him made my skin crawl, though I couldn't put my finger on it. For the next hour or so, I kept my eyes on him out of the corner of my eye. He seemed busy pulling out various pieces of equipment from his van. Oddly enough, they didn't look like typical camping gear. There was a large metal trunk, a couple of heavy chains, and bizarrely, what looked like a shovel. Who brings a shovel to a weekend getaway? If he was burying a body, he was sure going about it in broad daylight. I tried to brush it off. This was North Dakota. Everyone's got their quirks. But then, around dusk, he disappeared into the tall grass on the other side of the clearing, leaving his van behind. I thought maybe he was off to use the bathroom or something, though he was gone long enough that I wondered if he just wandered off. I went back inside my RV to grab a snack, trying to distract myself. A couple of hours later, as night finally took over the clearing, I heard a strange clanging sound outside. I peeked through the small window near the door. The guy was back, and he was digging furiously in the ground next to his van, a flashlight strapped to his head like he was mining for gold. He must have been at it for a while because a sizable hole had already formed by the time I noticed him. I stood there watching, debating whether to go over and ask what he was doing. Then he stopped suddenly and looked straight at my RV. I stepped back out of sight and tried not to breathe too loudly. After a few seconds, I heard his footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led toward my sight. My heart started pounding. I had left the door unlocked, and suddenly that felt like a mistake. Just as I was about to flip the lock, he knocked on the door, sharp and loud. "Hey, neighbor," he called out, his voice low now like he was sharing a secret. "Got a little situation over here. Mind helping out?" Every alarm bell in my head was going off. I'm not sure why I even considered opening the door. Maybe I thought he genuinely needed help, or maybe I just didn't want to seem like a coward. But when I cracked the door open a couple of inches, I realized just how wrong I was. His face was barely inches from mine, that scar twisting into something almost grotesque up close. "What are you doing out here all alone?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sizing me up. "Nice RV you got here. Lots of room inside, huh?" My mind was spinning for an answer. Yeah, just getting away for a bit. You know how it is." He grunted like that was funny somehow. "Look, I've got some, stuff I need to bury. Just some old junk, but I could use an extra set of hands." His fingers flexed around the handle of his shovel, the metal end of it catching the light from my RV's porch lamp. "I'd love to help," I lied, "but I'm actually in the middle of something. Maybe another time." He tilted his head, studying me with that twisted smile. "Ah, you're one of those guys, huh? The mind-my-own-business type." I nodded, hoping to end the conversation, but he didn't budge. The man stared at me for a beat too long before shrugging and heading back toward his van, but something told me he'd be back. I locked the door, grabbed my phone, and realized with horror that I didn't have a signal. There was no calling for help. Not here. I started looking around for something I could use as a weapon. A tire iron, a hammer, anything. For the next few hours, I sat in the dark, every nerve on high alert. My mind kept going back to Abby's words. People do weird things in the middle of nowhere. She had no idea how right she was. Just when I thought he'd left me alone, I heard it, heavy footsteps circling my RV slowly, deliberately. He was taking his time, letting me know he was still around, that he hadn't forgotten about me. Then, as suddenly as it began, the footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then a loud bang on the side of the RV. Then another, closer to the door. He was hitting it, testing it, looking for a weak spot. Desperation kicked in. I started thinking about my options. Running would mean leaving the RV behind, probably getting lost in the grassland, which was about as good as signing my own death certificate. But staying put wasn't much better. Finally, as I grabbed a kitchen knife, the door handle started rattling. I stood just behind it, knife at the ready. Then with a sharp kick, he forced the door open, and there he was, grinning that twisted grin. Without a word, he lunged forward to tie, but I managed to duck to the side and stab his arm, which only seemed to make him angrier. He swung the shovel, catching me across the shoulder, sending me sprawling onto the floor. "Little rat," he muttered, advancing on me, his voice cold. He raised the shovel again, but I kicked up, catching him in the gut just hard enough to make him double over. I scrambled up, adrenaline taking over, and slashed at him again, managing to cut a deep line down his arm. Blood started to pool on the floor, and he looked at it, almost surprised. For a second, he seemed to waver, like he hadn't expected me to fight back. But he recovered fast, reaching down and trying to drag me out of the RV by the leg. Kicking and scrambling, I managed to get a hold of the doorframe and swung the knife again, this time slicing his hand. He let go with a curse, and I seized the chance to slam the door shut. I locked it and jammed the chair under the handle, but I knew that wouldn't hold him forever. Through the small window, I saw him staggering back to his van, clutching his bleeding arm. I thought he was finally giving up, but he only paused to grab something, a can of gasoline. Before I could process it, he began pouring it around my RV, a sick grin plastered on his face. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my keys, jumped into the driver's seat, and gunned it, knocking him aside as I sped out of the clearing. I didn't look back until I was miles down the road, parked at a gas station, trying to catch my breath. That night, I called the cops, told them everything, but they found nothing when they checked the clearing. The man had vanished, taking his creepy van and his shovel with him. In the following weeks, I did some digging. Turns out there had been disappearances in the Cheyenne National Grassland over the years. People gone without a trace, bodies never found. I've always liked the quiet of the road. No one asking questions, no one poking into your business, just miles of highway, the hum of the engine, and the occasional crackle of a distant voice on the CB. But that night, somewhere on Route 50 in the middle of Nevada, the silence felt different. Too quiet, too heavy. It had been days since I'd had a decent break. I'd left San Francisco with a load of building materials bound for Kansas City, figuring Route 50 would cut the travel time. They call it the loneliest road in America, and I've driven it enough times to know why. For hours at a time, you don't see a soul, just endless desert dotted with mountains that never seem to get any closer. I was more tired than I wanted to admit, the kind of tired that sneaks up on you, where your eyelids grow heavy and the lines on the road start to blur. Normally I'd push through, but something told me to pull over this time. I glanced at the clock and decided to hit the next rest stop I saw. A quick nap, I told myself, and I'd be good as new. I felt a wave of relief when I spotted the weathered sign for a rest stop 2 miles ahead. The stop wasn't marked on my map, which was odd, but these old highways have plenty of places that don't show up anymore. The place looked like it hadn't seen a decent coat of paint in a decade. The lights above the parking area flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. A beat-up picnic table and a few rusted trash bins were all that marked the stop. The restroom building sat off to the side, its windows dark, and the air around it felt heavy like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I pulled the rig into the lot and killed the engine. Silence settled in around me, pressing through the windows. I leaned back in the driver's seat, rubbing my face. I just needed a few hours of sleep and I'd be good to go. But before I could settle in, nature called. Typical. With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The night air was cold, much colder than I'd expected for Nevada, and the wind carried a strange scent, dry, with an underlying hint of something rotten. I wrinkled my nose but kept moving toward the restroom. The building was worse up close. Graffiti covered the exterior, but it wasn't the usual stuff, no names or crude drawings. These were symbols, spirals, triangles, strange geometric shapes I couldn't quite place. Some of them were carved deep into the wood, like they'd been there a long time. I pushed the door open and the smell hit me harder inside, stronger than before. I flicked the light on, but the bulb overhead just buzzed and flickered weakly. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the room. The place was empty, as I expected, but the walls were covered in more of those symbols, dozens of them, carved into the tiles drawn on the mirrors. I did my business quickly, trying to ignore the feeling that those symbols were watching me, and made my way back out to the parking lot. That's when I saw the first figure. It was standing just beyond the reach of the flickering lights, a man in a heavy coat, his back to me, staring out into the desert. For a second, I considered calling out to him, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so quiet, made my gut twist. I stopped in my tracks, trying to decide if I should just get back in the truck and go. But the man didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice I was there. Maybe he was just another trucker, but I hadn't seen another rig on the road in hours. I took a step back toward my truck, keeping an eye on the figure. When I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushed something cold, too cold. I pulled my hand back, confused, and shone the flashlight on the handle. Symbols. Those same spirals and triangles scratched into the metal of my door. My heart started racing. I hadn't seen them there before. I would have noticed. I swallowed hard, scanning the lot, but the figure was gone, just vanished. I fumbled with the door, pulling it open and climbing back into the cab as fast as I could. I locked the doors and sat there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I'd driven across the country dozens of times, stopped in every kind of rundown, creepy rest stop imaginable, but nothing like this. The radio crackled to life suddenly, nearly making me jump out of my skin. For a second, I thought it was just picking up static, but then a voice broke through. Low, distorted. Frank. My heart skipped a beat. I snatched the CB mic. Who is this? Silence. I stared at the radio, waiting, but the voice didn't come back. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound of my name, it was too clear. I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the man in the coat, but the lot was empty. The only movement was the weak flicker of the overhead lights. Still, that rotten smell lingered, hanging in the air like a warning. I was about to start the engine and get the hell out of there when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. There was another figure now, standing near the restrooms. This one was closer. I couldn't make out their face in the dim light, but they were staring right at me. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but when I reached for the ignition, the engine sputtered and died before it could even turn over. I tried again. Nothing. The lights on the dashboard flickered weakly before going out altogether. Come on, I muttered, trying to stay calm. Don't do this to me now. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. No bars, no nothing. The figure was still there, closer now. Another figure appeared near the picnic table, and then another by the trash bins. They didn't approach, but they were closing in, little by little. My mouth was dry. I fumbled for the flashlight and shone it toward the restroom, hoping to get a better look at the figures. The beam of light cut through the dark, but when it hit the first figure, they were gone. Just gone. I swept the light across the lot, but all the figures had disappeared. Every single one. I didn't waste any more time. If my truck wasn't going to start, I'd fix it in the morning. For now, I just needed to get out of here, on foot if I had to. I grabbed the toolbox from under the seat just in case and jumped down from the cab. That's when I noticed something else on the side of my truck. Etched into the paint was one of those symbols. Fresh. I could smell the metallic tang of scratched metal. It was the same spirals and triangles I'd seen in the bathroom, the same ones that had been on the door handle. The smell hit me again, stronger now. I turned, shining the flashlight toward the restroom, and that's when I saw it. The symbols were glowing. A faint, sickly light pulsed from the walls of the building, the carvings and scratches now alive with some kind of energy. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, a low hum building in my chest. I stumbled back toward the truck, my flashlight shaking in my grip, but the lights in the building grew brighter, casting long, flickering shadows across the lot. And then I heard the voice again. Frank. I whipped around, scanning the empty lot, but there was no one there. No figures, no man in the coat. Just the voice, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Frank, you need to stay. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I kept moving, trying to get back into the cab. But the symbols, they were on my truck now, glowing with the same eerie light. The handle felt like ice under my fingers. The wind picked up, howling across the lot, carrying whispers with it. Low, urgent voices layered on top of each other, impossible to understand, but they felt old, ancient. I was frozen in place, trapped between the truck and whatever the hell was happening in that restroom. The lights, the symbols, the voices. I didn't know what to make of any of it, but I knew I had to leave now. The truck groaned as I climbed back into the cab, and I turned the key one last time, praying it would start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. Without another thought, I slammed the truck into gear and floored it out of the lot, the tires skidding on the cracked asphalt. The rest stop disappeared in the rearview mirror, the glowing lights and symbols fading into the distance. As I drove down the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. The silence of the road was back, but it wasn't the same. The weight of those symbols, the voice, it lingered. And I knew deep down that whatever was tied to that rest stop wasn't finished with me. I don't stop on Route 50 anymore, not after that night. Some places are better left in the past. My name is Samuel Ford, and back in 2019, I decided to take my old RV up to Udden National Park in Maine for a much-needed break after years of crunching numbers as an accountant. I thought some fresh air and nature would do me good. Besides, how hard could it be to roast marshmallows and enjoy the stars? I arrived at the park on a crisp September afternoon. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the landscape in shades of orange and red. I found a secluded spot near a quiet lake, set up camp, and felt the sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. As I struggled to set up a tent, more for the novelty than necessity, I couldn't help but laugh at myself. "City boy tries to conquer the wild," I muttered. If only my coworkers could see me now. That evening, I sat by the campfire, poking at the embers and listening to the sounds of the forest. The solitude was refreshing, but also a bit unnerving. Every rustle made me glance over my shoulder. "Relax, Samuel," I told myself. "The only serial killers out here are probably squirrels hoarding nuts." The next morning, I decided to take a hike along one of the lesser-known trails. A park ranger had mentioned it was a great way to see some hidden waterfalls. Armed with a map and a granola bar, I set off. The trail was overgrown, but the scenery was worth it. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the sound of rushing water grew louder as I walked. About an hour in, I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been occupied in decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the cabin, noticing strange symbols carved into the wooden door. Probably some teenagers playing pranks, I thought. Inside, the cabin was sparse, a broken table, a few chairs, and a musty smell that reminded me of my grandmother's attic. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint noise, a sort of muffled groan. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello? Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. No response. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound to a trapdoor, partially hidden under a tattered rug. Pulling it open, a waft of damp air hit me. There was a cellar below. "This is how horror movies start," I joked nervously, but something compelled me to descend the creaky wooden steps. At the bottom, the cellar was dark, but I could make out shapes hanging from the ceiling. As my eyes adjusted, I realized they were animal carcasses. Deer, rabbits, even a bear, all in various stages of decay. The smell was overwhelming. I covered my nose and turned to leave when I heard the cellar door slam shut above me. Panic surged through me. I raced up the stairs and tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Very funny," I shouted, hoping it was some prank. Silence. Then, footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. I searched frantically for another exit but found none. My phone had no signal. "Of course, this is why people shouldn't leave the city," I whispered to myself. Just then, a small window near the ceiling caught my eye. It was a tight squeeze, but desperation has a way of making you flexible. I stacked some old crates and managed to crawl out, scraping my arms in the process. Outside, I took a moment to catch my breath. The forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. I decided to head back to my RV as quickly as possible. As I retraced my steps, I felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement between the trees. Probably just wildlife, I told myself. Then, in a small clearing ahead, I saw him, a tall man wearing tattered clothes, his face obscured by a mess of unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. He was dragging something behind him. I hid behind a tree, peering cautiously. As he moved closer, I realized he was pulling a large sack stained dark with what could only be blood. My stomach turned. The man stopped suddenly and sniffed the air, like some kind of predator sensing its prey. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. After what felt like an eternity, he continued on, disappearing into the forest. I didn't wait around. I sprinted in the opposite direction, branches whipping against my face. I broke through the tree line and onto the trail, nearly colliding with another hiker. "Whoa, are you okay?" he asked, startled. "There's a man out here," I panted. "I think he's dangerous. We need to get help." The hiker's face paled. "You saw him too?" Before I could respond, a sharp whistling sound cut through the air. The hiker's eyes widened in shock before he collapsed, an arrow protruding from his back. I stared in horror as blood pooled around him. Fight or flight kicked in. I chose flight. I bolted down the trail, hearing footsteps behind me. The man's heavy breathing was getting closer. "Come back!" he shouted, his voice raspy. "I just want to talk." "Yeah, that's not creepy at all," I muttered, pushing myself to run faster. I spotted a fork in the trail and took the path to the left, hoping to throw him off. The foliage grew denser and the trail became less defined. I could hear the sound of water ahead, a river maybe. Bursting through the underbrush, I found myself at the edge of a steep drop-off overlooking a raging river below. Great, now what? I glanced back to see the man emerge from the trees, a twisted smile on his face, holding a blood-stained machete. "End of the line," he sneered. "Look, buddy, if this is about trespassing, I'm sorry. I'll just be on my way." He laughed, a chilling sound that made my skin crawl. "You've seen too much." "Seen what? A guy who seriously needs a barber?" He raised the machete and stepped forward. With no other options, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it at him. It struck his shoulder, causing him to stumble. Seizing the moment, I darted along the cliff's edge, searching for a way down. Behind me, I heard him recovering, his footsteps pounding after me. Up ahead, I spotted a fallen tree forming a makeshift bridge over the chasm. Better than nothing, I thought. Balancing carefully, I started across. Halfway through, the man reached the other end, shaking the log violently. "Not a fan of fair play, are you?" I yelled. He swung the machete, slicing into the log. The wood splintered, and I felt it give way beneath me. With a yelp, I leaped toward the other side, barely grabbing onto the ledge. My fingers clawed at the dirt as I struggled to pull myself up. Just then, a boot stomped on my hand. I cried out in pain. "You should have minded your own business," he growled. Desperation fueled me. I swung my other arm up, grabbing his ankle and yanking with all my might. Surprised, he lost his balance and toppled backward, giving me the chance to haul myself up. We both scrambled to our feet. Blood dripped from my scraped palms. He lunged at me, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped and tripped him, sending him crashing into a thorny bush. "Stay down," I warned, backing away. He didn't listen, pulling himself free. He charged again. My eyes darted around for anything I could use. My hand closed around a sturdy branch. As he closed in, I swung with everything I had. The branch connected with his head, and he collapsed. Breathing heavily, I checked his pulse. Nothing. I staggered back, dropping the branch. My hands were shaking. "This wasn't in the brochure," I mumbled. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone must have heard the commotion or found the hiker's body. I sank to the ground, exhaustion taking over. Later, the police questioned me extensively. Turns out the man was a former park ranger who went off the grid years ago after being implicated in several disappearances. They found his hideout, the cabin I had stumbled upon, along with evidence linking him to numerous unsolved cases. In the final twist, they discovered his journal detailing his warped mission to cleanse the park of outsiders. His name was Leonard Graves, a man who once dedicated his life to preserving nature but lost his sanity along the way. As for me, I think I'll stick to city parks from now on. My name is Jack Bennett, and back in 2017, I decided to take my RV up to the wild expanse of Denali National Park in Alaska. After years crunching numbers as an actuary, I figured some solitude might help me reconnect with the world beyond spreadsheets. I've always been a bit of an introvert, more comfortable with a good book than a crowded party, so an RV trip into one of the most remote national parks seemed like the perfect getaway. I packed enough supplies to last a week, including an embarrassing amount of instant noodles and a stack of mystery novels I had been meaning to read. The drive was long but breathtaking. Towering mountains loomed in the distance, and the trees seemed to stretch infinitely upward. I found a secluded spot near a clear glacial stream, a perfect campsite far from the main trails. Setting up was uneventful, aside from the moment I realized I'd forgotten a can opener. Great job, Jack, I chuckled to myself. Survived actuarial exams, but defeated by a can of beans. As dusk settled, I lit a campfire and sat back to enjoy the serenity. The sky was a tapestry of stars, more than I'd ever seen back home. I felt the contentment that had been missing for years. Just as I was about to turn in for the night, I noticed a faint light flickering through the trees. It was unusual, given how isolated my spot was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. After all, maybe I wasn't the only one seeking solitude. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the light. As I got closer, the sound of muffled voices reached my ears. Peering through the foliage, I saw a small clearing with an old cabin. 2 men were outside, huddled over something I couldn't quite make out. Probably just hunters, I thought, but something fell off. They were digging deep and fast, as if trying to hide something. I stepped on a twig and the snap echoed loudly. One of the men jerked his head up. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and wore a worn-out flannel shirt. His eyes scanned the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out sharply. Panicking, I switched off my flashlight and held my breath. "Smooth move," I berated myself silently. After a tense few moments, I heard one of them say, "Probably just an animal." I slowly retreated back to my campsite, every rustle sounding like an alarm. Back at the RV, I locked the door and tried to shake off the unease. Maybe they were just burying trash, I reasoned, but a nagging feeling told me otherwise. Sleep was elusive. Every noise outside was amplified in the stillness. Around midnight, a distant howl cut through the air. "Wolves," I whispered. "Nothing to worry about." The next morning, I decided to hike a nearby trail to clear my head. The fresh air and stunning vistas did wonders for my mood. I even managed to snap some photos that would make excellent desktop backgrounds. On my way back, I noticed something odd. A piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. It looked like part of a jacket, stained dark red. My stomach tightened. Maybe someone got hurt, I thought. But there were no footprints or signs of a struggle. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to pack up and find a ranger station to report what I'd seen. As I was loading up the RV, a voice startled me. "Leaving so soon?" I turned to see one of the men from the cabin leaning against a tree, a sly grin on his face. "Yeah, decided to cut the trip short," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Shame. Not many folks come out this way. Thought we could share a meal," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Thanks, but I've got a long drive ahead," I said, closing the RV door. "Safe travels, then," he nodded, but there was something menacing in his tone. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt path, glancing in the mirror to see him still watching me. As I drove, the path seemed different. Branches hung lower, and the road was rougher. After an hour, I realized I was going in circles. "Impossible," I muttered. I hadn't taken any turns, yet the surroundings were unfamiliar. The GPS was useless, showing only green wilderness. Frustrated, I stopped the RV to consult a map. That's when I heard the sound of an engine approaching. A beat-up pickup truck pulled up alongside me. It was the other man from the cabin, younger, with a shaved head. "Lost?" he asked through the open window. "Just a bit turned around," I admitted. "These roads can be tricky. Mind if I take a look at your map?" he offered. Something in me hesitated, but refusing might raise suspicion. "Sure," I said, handing it over. He studied it briefly. "You're way off. Need to backtrack and take a left at the fork you passed about 5 miles back." "Thanks," I said, reaching for the map. He held on to it a moment longer than necessary. "Be careful out here. Never know what you might run into," he warned, handing it back. "Appreciate the help," I replied, forcing a smile. He drove off, and I couldn't help but feel that the encounter was more than coincidental. Deciding not to follow his directions, I trusted my instincts and continued straight. Another hour passed, and the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low. Just when I was about to lose hope, I spotted a sign, "Ranger Station ahead." Relieved, I pulled into the gravel lot. The building looked old but maintained. Inside, a middle-aged woman in a ranger uniform greeted me. "Hello there." "You look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked. "Probably just my reflection after days without a proper shower," I joked weakly. She smiled. "What can I do for you?" I told her about the men, the digging, and the torn fabric. Her expression grew serious. "You're not the first to mention strange happenings around here," she said. We've had reports of missing hikers. Do you think they're involved? I asked. We're looking into it. In the meantime, it's best you stay here until we can get you escorted out safely. Stay here? Can I just refuel and go? Fuel supply is low. Next delivery isn't until tomorrow, she explained. Great. Stuck in a horror movie cliche. All right, guess I'm camping here tonight, I sighed. She offered me a room in the back. It wasn't the Ritz, but it beat sleeping in the RV with potential psychos roaming around. That evening, we chatted over canned soup. Her name was Linda, and she'd been a ranger for over 20 years. You learn to read people out here, she said. Those men you saw, I've got a bad feeling about them. Glad it's not just me, I replied. As night fell, a storm rolled in. Thunder echoed through the mountains and rain pelted the roof. Suddenly, the power went out. Backup generator should kick in, Linda said, but it didn't. I'll check it out. She grabbed a flashlight. Mind if I come with you? I didn't want to be alone. Sure. We stepped outside, the rain soaking us instantly. The generator was around the back. As we approached, a loud crack resounded. A tree had fallen nearby. That was close, I yelled over the storm. Linda inspected the generator. Looks like it's been tampered with, she frowned. By who? Before she could answer, a figure emerged from the darkness, one of the men from the cabin, holding an axe. Evening, he sneered. Linda reached for her sidearm, but the other man appeared behind us, wrenching it away. 2 for the price of 1, he laughed. Run! Linda shouted, shoving me aside. Before I could react, she tackled the man with the axe. The other grabbed her, and in the struggle, she was struck hard, collapsing to the ground. I bolted into the woods, adrenaline overriding any sense of direction. Behind me, footsteps splashed through the mud. Branches tore at my clothes, and the terrain became treacherous. I slipped, tumbling down a slope and landing hard at the bottom. Pain shot through my ankle. Just perfect, I groaned. I crawled into a hollow beneath a large tree, trying to catch my breath. The rain masked the sound of their pursuit, but I knew they were close. Minutes felt like hours. Then faint voices carried through the storm. Spread out. He couldn't have gone far, one of them yelled. I needed a plan. Remembering my phone, I pulled it out, no signal and water damaged. Useless. I spotted a fallen branch, sturdy and sharp. Better than nothing, I thought, arming myself. The voices grew louder. One of them was right above me. Come out, wherever you are, he taunted. Time to level the playing field. Summoning every ounce of courage, I lunged upward, striking him across the face. He stumbled back, shocked. You little? He growled, wiping blood from his nose. I didn't give him a chance to recover. Swinging again and connecting with his knee, he collapsed with a howl. Not sticking around for round 2, I limped away as fast as I could. The other man would have heard the commotion. Ahead, I saw a faint glow. A campfire. Desperate, I headed toward it. Bursting into the clearing, I found a group of hikers huddled under a tarp. Help me, please, I gasped. They stared in disbelief. What happened? One of them asked. 2 men. They attacked us. The ranger is down, I panted. Without hesitation, one of them grabbed a flare gun. Stay here, he instructed the others. Moments later, the second attacker crashed into the clearing. Seeing the group, he hesitated. That's him, I pointed. Back off, the hiker warned, aiming the flare gun. The attacker sneered. This isn't your fight. Like hell it isn't, the hiker retorted. The man assessed the situation, then slowly backed away. This isn't over, he threatened before disappearing into the darkness. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. We need to get to safety, the hiker said. There's a satellite phone in our gear. We'll call for help. They patched up my ankle as best they could. Within the hour, authorities were notified, and a rescue team was on the way. By dawn, helicopters circled overhead. Paramedics attended to Linda, who was injured but alive. The police apprehended the man I had injured. Turns out his name was Jake Mullins, a drifter with a criminal record. His partner, however, was still at large. Over the next few days, a search ensued. They discovered shallow graves near the cabin, victims who hadn't been as lucky. I provided my statement, and the gravity of what happened began to sink in. A week later, I was back home, the ordeal feeling like a surreal nightmare. Then I received a call from the police. They'd identified the second man, Evan Mullins, Jake's younger brother. He was still missing. Be cautious, the detective warned. He might hold a grudge. Great, I sighed. just when I thought it was over. Months passed without incident. Then one evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a photograph of me at the campsite, taken moments before I first met them. On the back, a scrawled message read, "See you soon." I reported it to the police, but without any leads, there was little they could do. I realized that while the physical journey had ended, the aftermath was far from over. Evan Mullins was still out there, and he had made it personal. But this time, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. I took precautions, security systems, self-defense training. They say numbers don't lie, and statistically, the odds were in my favor. But life isn't always about numbers. Sometimes it's about facing the unexpected with the same determination that gets you through actuarial exams or opens a stubborn can of beans. At least now, I'm prepared. I never wanted to drive Loveland Pass again. I hadn't been back on that stretch of road since the night Marty died, the night his rig went over the edge and disappeared into the fog like it had never existed. The only thing they found was twisted metal at the bottom of the canyon. I told myself it wasn't my fault, but the guilt stuck to me like oil on a rag, refusing to wash off no matter how many miles I put between me and that place. But Pete called in a favor. He needed me, and I owed him more than I could count. A convoy job through the Rockies, 3 trucks hauling high-value cargo to a research facility in Colorado. It was big money, but more than that, it was for Pete. He convinced me with a laugh over the phone. "Come on, Red, we need your experience out here." What could go wrong? I didn't laugh, not this time. So there I was, back in the driver's seat of my rig, with Pete leading the convoy and another trucker, Jerry, bringing up the rear. The snow-capped peaks of the Rockies loomed ahead as we started our ascent through Loveland Pass. The winding road snaked around the mountains, a narrow, dangerous route where one wrong move could send you tumbling into nothingness. The memories hit hard as soon as we passed the first switchback, the same stretch where Marty had lost control. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the familiar weight of regret in my chest. I'd spent years avoiding convoys, always driving solo. The ghosts from that night hadn't let me forget, and now I was back, like I was inviting them to haunt me all over again. "Red, you still with us?" Pete's voice crackled over the CB, cutting through my thoughts. I pressed the mic. "Yeah, still here. Roads are getting slick. We should take it slow." Pete agreed, and we settled into the grind, letting me navigating the treacherous turns with caution. The sun had set hours ago, and now only the thin beams of our headlights cut through the growing darkness. The fog rolled in thick and fast, curling around the edges of the road like ghostly fingers. That's when I saw it up ahead. Just barely visible through the fog was a pair of headlights. They flickered like a dying flame, appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist. I squinted, leaning forward, trying to get a better look. It was a truck, no doubt about it, but there was something familiar about the way it moved, the way it hugged the curves of the road like it had been driving this route for years. I keyed the mic again. "Pete, you see that truck up ahead?" Silence. Then Pete's voice came through, confused. "There's no truck, Red, just us." I glanced in the mirror. Jerry's headlights were still behind me, steady and unchanging. But the truck in front? It wasn't one of ours. I let go of the mic, my gut tightening. Maybe it was a local driver, someone familiar with the area. But as I watched it more closely, I knew that wasn't right. The truck was old, real old, the kind of rig you didn't see much on the road anymore. And then it hit me, hard and fast. The paint job, the faded red stripe down the side, the same color as the one Marty had on his rig. My chest tightened. "No," I whispered, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. It couldn't be Marty's truck. It was gone, destroyed, crumpled at the bottom of a canyon. But this was his rig. It had to be. The headlights flickered again, and then the truck was gone, swallowed by the fog like it had never been there. "Red, you good back there?" Pete's voice crackled through again. I didn't respond right away. My pulse was racing, my hands slick with sweat. I glanced around, looking for any sign of the truck, but the road was empty. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice shaky, just seeing things. But I wasn't seeing things. Not this time. We kept moving, the road winding higher, the fog thickening. The curves grew sharper, and the guardrails seemed to disappear into the mist, making it feel like we were driving on the edge of the world. That's when the CB crackled again, but this time it wasn't Pete or Jerry's voice. "Red, you gotta help me." The voice was faint, distorted, but I recognized it immediately. My heart stopped. "Marty?" I whispered, disbelief creeping into my voice. The radio stayed silent for a moment, but then it came again, clearer this time, like the words were being dragged through the static. "Red, help me, I can't hold on." I dropped the mic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Marty was dead, gone. But that voice, it was his. Down to the rasp he always had when he called me Red. I hadn't heard it in years, and yet here it was, crackling through the radio like a ghost from the past. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was just some weird interference. But the road ahead seemed to twist and shift unnaturally, like the mountains themselves were trying to trap us in. I checked my mirrors again, half expecting to see the ghost truck reappear, but there was nothing, just the thick swirling fog. "Pete, something's not right," I said into the mic, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should stop, let the fog clear." "Negative, Red, we've got a tight schedule. Keep moving." His response was sharp, almost panicked. Pete wasn't the type to scare easily, but I could hear the tension in his voice. He knew something was wrong too, but he didn't want to say it. The fog pressed in closer, and suddenly the road didn't feel familiar anymore. I'd driven this pass more times than I could count, but now it was like the route had changed. The turns were sharper, the drops steeper. I didn't know where we were headed anymore. And then I saw the truck again. It appeared out of the fog, closer this time, swerving wildly across the road. The old rusted cab, the faded red stripe. It was Marty's rig, no doubt about it. But when I pulled alongside, there was no driver. The cab was empty, the windows fogged over from the inside. My stomach lurched. I slammed the brakes, swerving to avoid the ghost truck, but it vanished into the mist as quickly as it had come. My truck fishtailed, tires screeching against the wet pavement, but I managed to hold it steady. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Red, what the hell's going on back there?" Pete's voice snapped through the radio. "I saw him," I muttered, barely able to catch my breath. "I saw Marty's truck." Silence hung in the air for a long moment. I knew Pete was processing what I'd said, trying to figure out if I was losing it or if there was something more. But before he could respond, the CB crackled again. Marty didn't make it. It wasn't Pete. It wasn't Jerry. It was Marty. His voice filled the cab clearer than before, as if he was sitting right next to me. "You let me go, Red. You let me fall." I clenched the wheel, anger and fear boiling in my chest. "I didn't let you fall. I tried, Marty. You didn't try hard enough." The road twisted again, sharper this time, and I could barely see the guardrail through the fog. But I kept driving, adrenaline coursing through me as Marty's voice echoed in my head. Suddenly, Pete's voice cut through the chaos. "Red, you gotta snap out of it. This isn't real." "It's the mountains messing with you," I snapped back. "Messing with me. Don't act like you don't hear him, Pete." Pete didn't answer. The road ahead dipped sharply, and I saw it. The same curve where Marty had gone over. The same stretch of road where his truck had disappeared into the canyon. My heart raced, my mind spinning. Was that where this was leading? Was I about to relive Marty's crash? "Marty, I'm sorry," I whispered, gripping the wheel tighter as the road curved dangerously toward the edge. "I'm so damn sorry." The fog lifted just enough for me to see what was ahead. Marty's truck in the middle of the road, blocking the pass. There was no time to stop, no time to think. I swerved hard, avoiding the ghost truck at the last second. My rig skidded, the wheels screeching as I fought to keep control. For a moment, I thought I was going over the edge. The wheels teetered on the lip of the canyon, the guardrail creaking under the weight of the truck. But I yanked the wheel, pulling the rig back onto solid ground. My breath came in ragged gasps. I looked in the rearview mirror. The ghost truck was gone. The fog was clearing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. "Red?" Pete's voice came over the radio, softer now. "You still with us?" "Yeah," I whispered, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. "I'm still here." The mountains stretched ahead, empty and quiet, but I could still hear Marty's voice in the back of my mind. And I knew, in some way, he'd always be with me. We made it through the pass just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the jagged peaks. The road ahead was clear, but I knew I'd never forget the night I'd faced Marty's ghost. My name's Patricia Guzman, and back in 2015, I decided to set out on what I thought was just going to be a peaceful camping trip. I'd rented an RV and was headed up to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, one of the last real wilderness areas left in the Midwest. I'd just gone through a messy breakup, one of those the dog stays with me deals, and thought that getting into the thick of nature might clear my head. Of course, I thought I'd be on my own for a few days, doing nothing more than fishing, grilling, maybe reading a bad detective novel. I wasn't really prepared for anything out of the ordinary. I mean, who would be? So there I was, parked at a site that was basically as far out as my RV could take me. Not a single soul in sight, just me and the trees pressing close, the smell of pine and the sounds of wind rushing through thick branches. I had my own little campfire going, cooking a half-burned hot dog and poking at the coals with a stick. The campsite was wedged between a rock face and a narrow trail that led into a small valley. The only access road was a twisting, barely there dirt path, something you need four-wheel drive just to crawl through, which was exactly why I had chosen it. I figured it would be a nice, quiet evening, maybe even boring. Around dusk, though, I heard something in the distance. At first, I brushed it off as a deer or some animal rustling in the brush, but it got louder. It was the kind of sound that sticks in your gut because it's too out of place. Not the typical crunch or snap of branches you'd expect, but something else, something heavier and somehow purposeful. I tried to laugh it off, muttering something dumb to myself like, "All right, Bigfoot, don't make me come over there." But the noise kept going, each crunch louder, closer, then silence. The kind of silence where you feel like the whole world's holding its breath. Out of nowhere, a man just walked right into my camp, as if he belonged there. No warning. No hello. Just there he was. Tall, wiry, with a face that looked like it had been whittled out of driftwood. He wore an old military jacket, camo pants, and heavy black boots caked in dried mud. His hair hung down like dirty straw, and there was something off about him. The way he stood too still, staring right at me with this dead expression, like he'd seen the worst things imaginable and carried them with him. "Got any spare firewood?" he asked, his voice low and scratchy, barely above a whisper. I don't know why, but my instinct was to play it cool. I told him sure, there was some by the fire, and gestured to a small pile next to my cooler. He just stared at me, unsmiling, before he picked up a few pieces and stacked them onto my fire like he owned it. Then he sat down across from me, close enough that I could see the dirt under his nails. "Nice spot you got here," he said, still not looking away. "Yeah," I mumbled, trying to keep things light. "Good place to get some peace and quiet. Not many folks around." "Peace is what people say they're after, until they find it," he replied, poking the fire with a stick. I laughed awkwardly, wondering what he was on about. He just sat there, still, like he was waiting for something. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, I tried to steer the conversation back to normal, asking if he was camping nearby. He didn't answer immediately, just stared at the flames as if he hadn't heard me. Finally, he looked up, fixing me with this unnervingly blank look. "I don't camp," he said, his voice steady, cold. "I'm just passing through, following an old path." It was at that point I started feeling like I might have made a mistake coming up here alone. This guy, whoever he was, didn't seem like someone who'd gotten lost on a weekend getaway. He felt intentional. The way he just sat there, his words dripping out slow, his gaze dark and unblinking. I cleared my throat, trying to break the spell. "Well, I'm heading out tomorrow anyway. Gotta get back to civilization, right?" I said, forcing a laugh. The man didn't blink. "You sure about that?" Now here's the thing. I was getting uncomfortable, but I didn't want to look like I was afraid of him, especially when we were miles from anyone who would hear me if I yelled. Instead, I tried to play it off, leaning back in my chair and cracking another cheap joke about Bigfoot. But the man didn't laugh. He just kept staring at me, his gaze sharpening, as if he was sizing me up. Then he asked, "You ever feel like something's watching you out here?" "Not really," I lied, though by now my skin was crawling. I shrugged and took a long sip from my bottle, hoping he'd take the hint and move along. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. They come out at night, you know, the quiet ones, the ones who don't belong anywhere else. You don't see them, but they see you. They know when you're alone. I tried to keep my face neutral, though inside, every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away. But what was I going to do? Just get up and walk into the trees with him sitting right there? So I sat there, trapped, my mind racing, waiting for him to give up and go. Eventually, he stood up, and I felt this rush of relief until he looked down at me and said, "Careful, not everything that goes into the woods comes back out." With that, he turned and walked off, disappearing down the path toward the valley. For a few minutes, I just sat there, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. I kept telling myself that he was just some weirdo, that I'd laugh about it later. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every sound, every whisper of leaves felt like it had a purpose, like it was waiting for me to let my guard down. Sometime around midnight, I heard the noise again, louder this time. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the area. Nothing but shadows. I almost convinced myself it was all in my head, until I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone ducking behind a tree. I yelled out, "Who's there?" hoping I sounded more intimidating than I felt. No answer. I shone the flashlight in the direction where I'd seen the movement, and that's when I saw it. A small pile of sticks arranged in a circle right by the edge of my campsite, like some kind of makeshift trap or marker. And right in the center was my old pocket knife, one I'd left back in the RV. I didn't waste another second. I spun around, scrambling back to the RV as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and I barely managed to get the door shut before I heard footsteps crunching outside. Inside, I locked everything I could, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I peered out through one of the windows, just in time to see him standing there. In the beam of my flashlight, I dropped. He didn't even look angry, just determined. Without taking his eyes off the RV, he reached down, picked up my flashlight, and flicked it off, plunging everything into darkness. My whole body froze. I didn't know what to do, so I just waited, every nerve on edge, listening for any sound, any clue. Then, like some horror movie cliche, I heard the slow scrape of metal along the side of the RV. I don't know if it was a knife, a piece of wire, or something worse, but he dragged it slowly, deliberately, making sure I knew he was still there, waiting. I gripped my phone, fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911, but there was no signal out here. Nothing. Hours passed like that. Every now and then he'd make another sound, tapping on the window, scraping along the wall, or whispering something I couldn't quite make out. Just loud enough to keep me alert, just quiet enough to keep me guessing. Then, as dawn started to break, I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. He was gone, or at least I thought he was. The campsite was dead quiet, like he'd never been there at all. But the ground around my RV was littered with sticks, broken branches, and strange little symbols carved into the dirt. Right by my door, he'd left a note, scrawled on a scrap of bark, a final parting gift. The note was simple: not everything that goes into the woods comes back out. Remember that. I didn't waste any more time. I threw everything I could grab into the RV, fired up the engine, and got out of there without looking back. I've always prided myself on being the guy who keeps his cool no matter what. That's why I was leading this trip deep into the Blackwater Ridge, Manila National Forest. It was supposed to be a challenge, and I was ready for it. I'd hiked dozens of trails tougher than this, and I wanted to prove that to my old friends, especially Nate, who couldn't even set up a tent without breaking a sweat. But there's something about being miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but endless trees, that starts to mess with your head. As soon as we arrived, I could feel it. Not that I'd let anyone see that, of course. "Kara, you got the map?" I called out as we packed up the last of the gear. "Yep, but I doubt we'll need it with you in charge," she winked, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. I grinned. She knew how to stroke my ego, one of the things I loved about her. Nate, on the other hand, was struggling to adjust the straps of his pack. His face was already red, and we hadn't even started walking yet. "Can we take it slow, guys?" I haven't done this in a while. Sure, Nate, we'll pace ourselves, I said, trying to hide my impatience. Sarah, ever the practical one, rolled her eyes but said nothing. She was the scientist of the group, the one who'd be lecturing us about rare plants and ecosystems halfway up the trail. She was here more for research than the hike, but I knew she could handle herself. We hit the trailhead late in the morning, the sun already filtering through the thick canopy above. The first couple of miles were easy enough, well marked, a few uphill climbs, nothing too rough. Nate fell behind pretty quickly, as expected, but we made enough stops to let him catch up. By the time we reached our first campsite, the air had a heavy, oppressive feel. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The dense foliage seemed to swallow up the light, leaving us in a strange twilight. We set up camp without much trouble, although Nate complained about the weight of his gear the whole time. Our tents were cheap, sure, but they did the job. Sarah was meticulous, making sure her tent was perfectly aligned with the slope of the ground. "It's going to rain tomorrow," she said, almost as an afterthought. "Clear skies right now," I pointed out, but she just shrugged. Night came quickly, faster than I expected. By the time we had the fire going, the forest had gone almost completely silent. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was weird. I'd been in plenty of forests, but something about this one felt off. "You guys hear that?" Nate said, glancing around nervously. "Hear what?" Kara asked, stirring the pot of stew she'd made over the fire. "No, it's like, I don't know, like something moving out there." I paused, listening. At first, there was nothing, but then I heard it too. Soft, distant, and low. A growl, almost like the sound of a heavy breath. "Coyotes," I said, trying to sound confident. "Nothing to worry about. They're probably more scared of us than we are of them." But I saw Sarah tense up. She was studying the woods beyond the firelight, her face set in concentration. I didn't like that. When I turned back to Nate, he was pale, fidgeting with his hands. "Maybe we should keep the fire going all night," he said. "Relax, Nate. We're fine. Nothing's coming near us." But the truth was, something felt off. Even I couldn't shake it. The second day was rough. The terrain started to get steeper, and the trail was less defined. Nate was falling behind more often, and Kara's enthusiasm was starting to wane. We pressed on, but there was a growing sense of unease that none of us could shake. Halfway through the day, we found something that made me stop in my tracks. A deer carcass, ripped apart and strewn across the trail. Blood, dark and congealed, soaked into the ground around it. Whatever had killed it wasn't hunting for food. It looked like something had torn it apart just for the hell of it. Nate gagged, turning away. "What the hell?" Kara knelt beside the body, her face a mix of curiosity and horror. "This wasn't a bear. Look at the size of these tracks." I crouched down next to her. She was right. The prints were huge, human-like, but twisted. Something was wrong with the feet. Long, deep claw marks gouged into the dirt. I glanced at Sarah. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed in deep concern. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "We should go back." The confident TJ, who could handle anything, suddenly felt a sliver of doubt crawl up his spine. "Nah, we're fine," I said, brushing it off. "It's just some animal. We'll be careful. Let's keep moving." But I knew. We all knew. Something was out there, watching. That night was worse. We set up camp earlier, just as the sky began to darken. The wind picked up, carrying a strange metallic scent. Something foul. The air felt heavy, thick with unexplainable dread. The fire crackled low, throwing flickering shadows on the tents, but none of us felt the comfort of its warmth. We sat closer than usual, even Nate, who had barely spoken since we found the deer. I sat there gripping the handle of my knife, trying to tell myself I was just being paranoid. But when I looked at the faces of my friends, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling it. "Do you hear that?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. We all went silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind in the trees. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, closer this time. "What the hell is that?" Nate's voice cracked, his eyes wide with fear. "It's just an animal," I said again, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince anymore. But it wasn't. We all knew that. This was something different, something wrong. From the shadows beyond the firelight, something moved. It was fast, so fast I barely caught a glimpse. But I saw enough. A tall, hunched figure just beyond the ring of light, watching us. Its eyes glowed bright and unnatural. Kara stood up. "I'm gonna check it out." "No," Sarah hissed, grabbing her arm. "Stay here, don't be stupid." But Kara, always fearless, shook her off and stepped into the darkness. "Kara," I shouted, grabbing my flashlight. I scanned the darkness, then I saw it. A tall, gaunt creature with dark, leathery skin and glowing red eyes. It lunged. Kara screamed. We ran, and we never saw her again. My name's Gregory Graham, and back in 2014, I was out in the forests around Hoh Rainforest, Washington, in Olympic National Park, where I was set to spend a quiet weekend RV camping. I had just turned 45 and figured I could use a weekend without email, social media, or any reminders that I was getting older. A few days with the forest and the mist, all those heavy canopies of trees shutting out the world. That's what I wanted. But I'd forgotten that unplugging only means you're open to different, stranger types of connections. The first day went fine, though. I'd driven around to a nice, secluded spot in the park, pretty far from the crowds. I met a ranger in passing who gave me that look. Park rangers give when they see someone heading to an area that most people avoid, like he wanted to warn me but figured I knew what I was doing. Honestly, the only thing that made me feel cautious was the weather. It was overcast, and as the night started setting in, the mist turned everything darker than I'd expected. I cooked up some quick food, nothing fancy, a classic mix of canned beans and sausage, before settling in. I decided to sit outside the RV with a beer and listen to the silence, something you don't get in the city. There were sounds, sure, the wind in the trees, the occasional crackle of underbrush from some unseen creature, but it was peaceful, at least until I heard something distinctly human. It was a laugh, low and throaty, coming from somewhere in the trees, just loud enough that it couldn't be my imagination. For a minute, I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just other campers messing around. But I couldn't shake this feeling. Something was off, and I hadn't seen anyone else around here since the ranger. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by a muttered voice I couldn't quite make out. I felt my skin prickle. Part of me wanted to go back inside, lock up the RV and forget about it. But another part of me, maybe the part that was a bit too curious, wanted to see who it was. So I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it in the direction of the sound. Nothing. Just endless trees and mist hanging thick in the air. And then, almost as if my curiosity had triggered it, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flash of something pale moving through the trees. I swung the flashlight in its direction, but the light cut through only empty air and mist. I was about to turn back when the laughter came again, closer and clearer this time. It wasn't alone. There was a crunch of footsteps, heavy ones, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. I aimed the flashlight again and caught sight of a man standing half hidden in the shadows, his face barely illuminated. He was tall, with wild, unkempt hair and a grin that stretched a little too wide. His clothes were torn, but it was his hands that caught my attention. One of them held what looked like a knife, a big, rusty hunting knife. "Hey, you mind keeping it down?" I said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. My voice cracked. He just laughed in response, tilting his head as though he was amused by my attempt to keep things normal. "Out here all by yourself?" he asked, taking a step closer. "No, actually." I lied. "Friends are just a little further up the trail." My voice sounded more confident than I felt, but the man didn't buy it. He just stood there grinning, tilting his head back and forth like he was trying to decide if he'd heard that one before. "You're lying," he said with a kind of certainty that made my stomach drop. And then he moved. Fast. Faster than I thought possible for someone who looked as disheveled as he did. I stumbled back, shining my flashlight frantically around, trying to keep him in view. But he'd vanished into the trees. I knew I should head back to the RV and lock myself in, but some part of me wanted to believe he was just a crazy local, maybe a prankster trying to give me a scare. I barely made it a few steps before I heard him again, the laughter echoing, surrounding me like it was coming from every direction. I'd lost track of him, and in that moment I realized how stupid I'd been to come out here alone, unarmed. I finally broke into a sprint back toward my RV, trying to ignore how heavy my own footsteps sounded in the silence, each crunch of leaves and snap of branches echoing back at me. As I reached the RV, I grabbed the handle, yanked it open, and jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it in a quick twist. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding against my ribs like a drum. For a few minutes, it was quiet again. I kept the lights off, crouching down by the window and peeking out, looking for any sign of movement outside. But everything was still. Maybe he'd lost interest. Maybe he was just some messed up guy trying to get his kicks. I had just started to relax when I heard it, a metallic scraping right along the side of the RV. Slow. Methodical. Like someone was dragging something sharp across the metal just to let me know they were still out there. The man's voice came again, a low whisper, almost right next to the window. "You think you can hide in there, friend? You think that little door is going to keep me out?" I held my breath, fighting the urge to make a sound, hoping he'd think I was gone. But then he did something unexpected. He started laughing again, a slow, sickening chuckle that felt like it seeped through the walls of the RV. I wanted to call for help, but there was no signal out here. The reality of being completely isolated hit me hard. I heard footsteps circling the RV, a slow, mocking pace, as if he was enjoying dragging this out. Then came a thud against the door, so sudden I nearly jumped out of my skin. I clamped a hand over my mouth, pressing my back against the inside wall, feeling the tremors of each bang as he pounded against the door. "Open up, or I'll open it for you," he taunted. I scrambled for anything I could use as a weapon. All I had was a heavy flashlight, which felt pitifully inadequate against someone with a knife. But it was better than nothing. I gripped it tightly, ready to swing if he managed to get through. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the banging stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, my pulse still hammering in my ears. I crept to the window, peeking out to see if he'd gone. But the fog was so thick I couldn't see past a few feet. And then, another bang, this time from the back of the RV. He was toying with me, trying to make me panic. I thought about making a run for it, but the idea of stepping outside with him lurking around made my blood run cold. I decided to wait, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But he didn't leave. The next sound I heard was worse. It was the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. My stomach dropped as I realized he'd found a spare key. Or maybe he'd had one all along. The door creaked open just a crack, and I saw his face peeking through. That same twisted grin. I didn't hesitate. I swung the flashlight as hard as I could, catching him off guard and knocking him back a few steps. He stumbled, more out of surprise than pain, and I took my chance. Bolting out of the RV and into the mist, I ran, not caring where, just away from him. I could hear his footsteps behind me, closing in fast, his laughter echoing through the trees. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going, zigzagging through the trees, hoping to throw him off. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a clearing. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. I could still hear him, his footsteps getting closer. Slower, like he knew he had me cornered. But then, another sound. A distant voice calling my name. It was the ranger, the one I had passed earlier. Relief flooded me, and I called out, waving my arms frantically. The ranger appeared, his flashlight cutting through the mist, and he stopped short when he saw my face. He didn't ask any questions, just grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. Together we made our way back through the forest, the ranger glancing over his shoulder every few steps. When we reached the safety of the main trail, he radioed for backup, keeping his voice low as if he didn't want to alert the man who'd been following me. Later, I learned that the man had been spotted in the area before, rumored to be an escaped convict who'd taken refuge in the forest, surviving off whatever he could find, or whoever he could find. The ranger explained that they'd found evidence of his camps scattered throughout the park, along with remnants of clothing, food cans, and other more disturbing items. A handful of bones, scattered and half buried. It was enough proof to close the trails, to warn campers that sometimes the wilderness holds more than just trees and streams. It holds people like him, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander alone. The authorities never caught him, and the trail remained closed for months. I knew, logically, I was safe. But I could still remember that laughter, that look in his eye. The ranger told me he'd seen men like him before, men who'd turned the wilderness into a hunting ground. Guess he thought you were next on the list? The ranger said with a wry smile.